We often assume that whatever happened was bound to happen. That's what we call hindsight bias. But before it happens, we're never really sure. Take the Cold War, what is now Russia, then the formidable Soviet Union, and China, which was no less formidable. America, with a relatively small ground force, managed to contain these two giants across the vast Eurasian continent, balancing delicately between them and ultimately embracing China, defeating the Soviet Union not through chess, but by playing Go strategically and patiently. That's how I explained it last time. So what many didn't realize was that the US and China had a relationship so close it could almost be described as a marriage. In 1972, President Nixon heard an unusual remark from Zhou Enlai, then China's premier. We encouraged them not to retreat by shelling them. We only fired on odd-numbered days and paused on even days and holidays. They understood our intent and held their ground. That's how he phrased it. Very Chinese in style, layered and complex. At the time when Kissinger and Nixon met with Mao Zedong or Zhou Enlai, their conversations were often philosophical, very typical of Chinese diplomacy. In contrast, Americans, even when being diplomatic, tend to speak in direct and explicit terms. Zhou Enlai was somewhat abstract, but Mao Zedong was downright enigmatic. He spoke in philosophical riddles. That might reflect Chinese culture, or more broadly, an East Asian way of communication. But should we dismiss it as merely cultural nuance? As I mentioned before, there's Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait that separates it from the mainland. Think of it like Korea's Baekneung Island. Taiwan controls offshore islands like Kinmen and Matsu. From Taiwan's perspective, holding those islands is a strategic but vulnerable position. Especially today, with China's military might, those islands are barely half a day's reach away. Yet surprisingly, Zhou Enlai sent a message to Chiang Kai-shek, do not withdraw from Kinmen. Because back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower warned that any attack on Taiwan could trigger a nuclear response when China began shelling Kinmen. But China wasn't attacking Taiwan proper. It was shelling Kinmen right off the coast of Fujian province. That raised the question, should we really go to nuclear war over this? Still, the US had drawn a line. Attacking Taiwan would mean nuclear retaliation. It put everyone in a diplomatic bind, an unsolvable dilemma. Fast forward about 15 years from that crisis. Zhou Enlai later claimed it had all been intentional on their part. That's why they fired artillery only on odd-numbered days. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek was pleading desperately with the Americans, saying, if the 7th Fleet doesn't come soon, we're finished. In truth, Chiang Kai-shek knew what was going on. He understood that China didn't actually want Taiwan to pull its forces out of Kinmen. It seems paradoxical. Why shell the island then? Yet somehow he got the message. Eisenhower, on the other hand, told Chiang to retreat from Kinmen immediately. He advised Taiwan to abandon those offshore islands. America couldn't defend them anyway. But China signaled the opposite. Don't retreat. And that was their intent all along. Before this class, many of you may not have even heard of Kinmen and Matsu. But here's why they matter so much. To Taiwan, Kinmen and Matsu are what Taiwan is to the United States. Is Taiwan strategically important to the US? Then flip it. Are Kinmen and Matsu strategically vital to Taiwan? That's a fair question to ask. Some scholars would argue they are, others would say they're not. But what I want you to see is this. They are important to China. And here's why. To China, what matters is having something at Kinmen that they can poke and pressure. Do you get it? It's about maintaining a pressure point. Both Taiwan Strait crises were centered on Kinmen and Matsu. And now, with China's rise in power, the recent Taiwan crisis, when Speaker Pelosi visited, China launched missiles targeting Taiwan itself. Back in the 1950s, they didn't have missiles capable of reaching Taiwan directly. China was far weaker then, but Kinmen was just a day's reach away. For Chinese strategists, holding the initiative has always been paramount. That's why Kinmen is useful. When China fires artillery there, the West scrambles, they freak out. We don't always understand why it matters so much. But if you think carefully, not rationally, but intuitively, it's not so different from what North Korea does today. Are you deeply engaged? Do you constantly dream of seeing the two Koreas unified? Are you actually paying attention? You mostly live as if North Korea doesn't exist until it makes its presence felt. That dynamic feels quite similar. But here's the key. Zhou Enlai actually said this. It's in Kissinger's memoirs. And we told Chiang Kai-shek not to retreat from there. Had Eisenhower known this at the time, he would have been stunned. He would have gone into crisis mode, sent ships, evacuated Taiwanese troops from Kinmen, total chaos. And yet, surprisingly, Chinese forces never fired on American ships because they were ordered not to. In short, it was political theater. And the key is, Chiang Kai-shek knew the whole time. He knew it was just shelling for show, no real action would follow. Today's topic is the geopolitical divorce between the US and China, but how serious is it really? Even now, doesn't China secretly want the US to stay involved in Taiwan? Just as it didn't want Taiwan to retreat from Kinmen? Does it now hope America won't retreat from Taiwan? Mao and Zhou genuinely wanted that balance to remain, because China's navy couldn't project power all the way to Taiwan at the time. Sure, they could launch an attack, but occupying and holding it, that was another story. Their naval strength was limited, and just beyond Taiwan lay the Japanese archipelago. So is today's Taiwan drama still just a performance on China's part? Do they in fact want the US present, want it to exert influence? Do they prefer Taiwan staying as it is while they occasionally stir the waters with a missile or two, so the world reacts, gasps, and scrambles just as planned? It's worth pondering, is this the Chinese way of managing the game? Or is China genuinely saying, America, get out, this is our front yard and this is our country? The claim that Taiwan is part of China has been a core principle of the Communist Party. Ever since it took the mainland and declared the People's Republic, reunifying Taiwan remains an unaltered national goal. To China, Taiwan is officially part of its sovereign territory. The US, for its part, agreed not to challenge that position openly. But during the Vietnam War, the US had a military presence in Taiwan. Taiwan served as a logistics hub for US forces, Marines and Navy units stationed in Japan, who would first stage in Taiwan before deploying to Vietnam. So yes, American troops were physically present there. Later, the US agreed to withdraw its forces from Taiwan, but it did not agree to sever ties with Taiwan, nor did it promise to stop protecting Taiwan. Mao and Zhou never even demanded that, perhaps because they were too desperate at the time. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the common enemy uniting China and the US vanished. Their alliance had been based on mutual opposition to the USSR, so once it was gone, what remained? Their systems, cultures, everything else were fundamentally different. So there was no longer a reason to maintain that alliance, right? That's the context for what happened in 1989, 1990, and 1991. Then there was the Tiananmen incident in 1989. Students and citizens gathered in Tiananmen Square and occupied it for over a month, shouting bold, radical slogans. It's China, so everything is on a grand scale. But that enormous structure they erected, it baffles me. How a civilian protest could build something that massive, I can't explain it. The protesters themselves denied building it. It looked strikingly similar to the Statue of Liberty in the US. Even though reformists had influence in the Chinese Communist Party, Zhao Ziyang was the general secretary at the time. And it was Hu Yaobang's funeral. Both he and Zhao Ziyang were reformists who had survived the Cultural Revolution. People began gathering at Tiananmen with flowers for Hu's memorial, and it escalated into a massive protest. I saw it unfold, not live, but it was on the news every single day, because it lasted for weeks, and there were many foreign journalists on the ground. I still remember seeing those images vividly. At the time, Eastern Europe was also moving toward reform and openness. So it seemed natural to assume that China too was opening up through this movement. Some even believed this could lead to political liberalization. But they crushed it. With tanks, China claimed only a few hundred were killed. But in 2014, a classified US document was declassified, and it's likely the more accurate account. There was a reason it had been classified. Reportedly, 10,454 people were killed. How could they know the number so precisely? They counted via satellite, bodies were covered with tarp-like sheets. Why was this information declassified in 2014? Of course, China was in the most difficult position. At the time, George H.W. Bush had just taken office. He was Reagan's vice president before becoming president. The Tiananmen crackdown occurred less than 5 months into his presidency. So it was a deeply shocking event for the US administration. Most people didn't know it, but China and the US had essentially been Cold War allies. America often makes such quiet arrangements. To confront Germany and Japan, the US formed a military alliance with the ideologically opposite Soviet Union, right? Later, to counter the Soviets, it embraced China and formed another strategic alliance. By then, the Soviet Union was faltering, nominally reforming, but clearly weakened. And then China created a massive crisis. As you might guess, the real dilemma for the US is managing its own idealism. That idealism matters, not because it's for show, but because it's sincere. Most countries don't have that kind of idealism. I mentioned deep-rooted tree last time, but let me return to that thought. In our society, the dominant value is equality, for better or worse. To me, it's like a monster, powerful but unpredictable. If properly channeled, it can drive great progress. If misused or exploited, it can cause collapse. For America, that core driver is idealism. And idealism never just sits quietly. George H.W. Bush built his career in diplomacy. He was involved in the Nixon administration. But before full diplomatic relations were established with China, there were many steps to go. The US set up a liaison office in Beijing, which was, in practice, the embassy. And the first head of that office, a young George H.W. Bush was so fond of China, he rode a bicycle around Beijing and even learned Mandarin just so he could talk to people in the streets. The president he served, Ronald Reagan, had been governor of California. Reagan was a staunch anti-communist, which made China quite uneasy. But Reagan was politically astute, very sharp. Reagan would harshly criticize communism, but always directed specifically at the Soviet Union. He left China out of the rhetoric, continuing détente with them. Vice President Bush was, by all accounts, openly pro-China. It was practically written on his forehead. But shortly after Bush became president, China caused an international uproar. They ran over unarmed citizens with tanks on live TV for the entire world to see. And then they just wiped their hands, claimed a few hundred deaths, even though everyone knew that wasn't true. In response, President Bush approved all the sanctions that Congress had already been preparing. Loans and credits to China were frozen. Planned high-level talks were postponed indefinitely, as they had to be. And yet, less than a month after the crackdown, Bush sent a long personal letter to Deng Xiaoping. The message, in short, was, please understand America's position. Not to condemn or criticize China's brutal crackdown on its own students, but to explain, not to rebuke, not even to express regret. The letter asked China to understand that America had no choice but to react as it did. The US president was essentially offering a justification, starting from America's founding ideals. China committed the atrocity. And the massacre happened on June 4th. Bush's letter was sent on June 21st. It was all classified at the time. From the outside, it seemed like the US was going to take China to task diplomatically. But what really happened was the kind of quiet diplomacy we're only now beginning to see. That's the very question I'm raising today. Are we witnessing a repeat of 1989? Or is what we're seeing now genuinely real? That's what we need to discern. Is this just another performance? Are they sending secret letters again behind the scenes? That's how serious it was. They sent a secret envoy less than a month later. That envoy was none other than General Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. And he was urgently accompanied by Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger. Even within China, the visit wasn't properly communicated through official channels. So when their plane appeared, the Chinese Coast Guard locked on and waited for orders. Should we shoot? That's how tense and chaotic it was. Do we fire or not? The envoys met Deng Xiaoping to deliver the US position. That's when the two sides quietly agreed to orchestrate a small gesture of reconciliation. I mentioned last time, ping-pong diplomacy was a form of staged diplomacy. This too was staged at the time inside the US embassy in Beijing. A Chinese human rights lawyer had jumped the fence and sought asylum. But would China allow him to leave? The embassy is US territory, but once outside, he's on Chinese soil. So of course China refused. So that asylum request became the basis for a diplomatic gesture. They staged a show to paper over the crisis between the two nations. So yes, behind the scenes, things were messy and multi-layered, under the condition that the dissident wouldn't be used as a propaganda tool by foreign media. They quietly arranged for him to be sent to a third country and disappear from public view. In any case, the Bush administration needed China to appear to be making an effort. China was scrambling, still weak at the time, yet taking a hardline stance toward the US. They said things like, "We won't cooperate. If that's how you act, then we're done." And then they said to America, "You beat black people to death in your own streets. You've got human rights issues too. Who are you to lecture us? This is a domestic matter. Whether we kill 10,000 or 100,000, it's still our internal affair. So stop meddling." They were deeply offended by the American stance, the president and key figures in his administration. In my view, and this is my interpretation, virtually went begging to Deng Xiaoping. saying, "If you do this for us, we'll lift the sanctions in time." When George H.W. Bush passed away, he was widely praised as a respected statesman. During the seismic shifts of world history, the fall of Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world didn't descend into economic or political chaos. He's credited with steering the global order safely, an exceptionally capable president. Geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan once said, "If Bush had served 4 more years, the course of American and global history would have changed completely," because Bush had extraordinary global awareness, a quality rare among US presidents. But there's one thing he gets criticized for. Why did he let China off the hook? Even after China caused such an overt global incident, why was the US so eager to maintain a honeymoon phase, rushing to patch things up? That's the core of the criticism against President George H.W. Bush. It's a viewpoint mostly held by idealists. Ordinary Americans at the time shared that very sentiment after the Tiananmen Square incident. Of course, any expression of dissent was timid and brief, quickly shut down by young soldiers. Today, such attempts are virtually impossible. After a few incidents, the state no longer tolerates them. Even small gatherings are met with immediate intervention by public security officers. I've been to Tiananmen a few times. It has a very tense atmosphere. Both uniformed and plainclothes officers are always watching. People don't even gather in small groups anymore. So what did Deng Xiaoping do? He launched what's known as the Southern Tour. In English, it sounds simple, just Southern Tour. After Tiananmen, Deng formally retired from politics. He quickly appointed a successor. First, the hardliner Li Peng served as premier. Li's hardline stance was useful during the crackdown, but unsuitable for long-term leadership. So Deng appointed Jiang Zemin, who had political experience in Shanghai and the southern provinces. But Jiang lacked charisma. He was a technocrat, so Deng had to put in considerable effort to elevate him. Even in working with the US, Deng used concessions, like allowing the dissident lawyer to escape the embassy, in exchange for an invitation for Jiang Zemin to visit the United States. Of course, President George H.W. Bush couldn't go that far. It was under President Clinton that Jiang Zemin finally made a state visit to the US. This leads us to an important observation about Chinese politics. Deng Xiaoping was the only uncontested political leader after Mao, but even he couldn't always get his way. China was simply too vast and complex. The first generation of revolutionaries, Deng's peers, were still alive and watching closely from within the system. And many of them were deeply skeptical, even hostile, toward Deng's reform and opening up policies. After the Tiananmen crackdown, China saw a renewed ideological split between reformists and those who wanted to return to Maoist radicalism. There was real tension over the country's direction. That's why Deng launched his famous Southern Tour as a strategic move. He toured reformist cities, delivering speeches. It seemed simple, but it was deeply symbolic. When I visited Shanghai, I even saw posters of it. Even 20 years later, those posters were still up. Initially, Chinese state media didn't report on the tour at all. The story broke in Hong Kong, while mainland media hesitated. It wasn't until April, 2 months later, that they began reporting it domestically. But once coverage began, it was framed as the party's official direction. After that, Deng disappeared from public view and eventually passed away. That tour was made when he was already 87 years old. He left behind many iconic statements during that tour. He famously said, "Development is the absolute principle." So he said, "I ordered the Tiananmen crackdown because I had to preserve China." But that doesn't mean I believe reform has failed. We must continue opening up and reforming. We begin with economic reform. If we pursue political reform at the same time, we'll end up like the Soviet Union. You saw what happened to the USSR? That's not what I want. We must preserve the firm leadership of the Communist Party, but still continue reform and opening up. That was his line. That's the doctrine of the mean. Deng Xiaoping embodied balance. People like Zhao Jiang leaned too far toward liberalization, while figures like Li Peng wanted to return to the old ways, back to Maoism. Down with capitalism. But these subtle ideas aren't easily grasped by the uneducated masses. So Deng had to show it, physically, symbolically, through action. That's why Western media, especially via Hong Kong, gave this huge coverage. They said, look, China is trying, let's give them some time. So despite the massive trauma of Tiananmen, a forgiving mood began to spread across the West. Clinton actually campaigned on criticizing Bush's soft stance on China. But once in office, Clinton realized he couldn't govern based solely on his campaign rhetoric. He shifted to realism, inevitably. So in visible terms, The US president who enabled the rise of modern China was Bill Clinton, because it was during President Clinton's term that most obstacles between the US and China were removed. China even joined the World Trade Organization, WTO. As we all know, under the WTO framework, China has consistently violated rules on currency policy and intellectual property rights. If they were evaluated today, they might not even qualify for WTO membership. And yet around 2001, President Clinton gave his full endorsement. He signed off on it dramatically and decisively. Many American goods and services still face barriers in China. Just as China can compete freely and fairly in our market, American products and services should have the same freedom and fairness in China. Today's US hawks would take that speech and say, can Google enter China, YouTube, Facebook? Why not? After all, WTO membership is supposed to mean mutual openness. But China has always been the exception. That shows how important China was to the US. It made sense when the Soviet Union was still around. But once the USSR collapsed, why did Bush and Clinton go this far? It remains something of a mystery. Maybe more details will emerge as classified documents are released. But that's just the surface, only a narrow reading. Jiang Zemin came to the US and placed a massive order for Boeing airplanes. They ordered 50 jetliners, a massive gift package laid at the table. Clinton grinned from ear to ear, declaring this will create tens of thousands of jobs. Politicians with sharp instincts like Clinton know how to make us feel good about it. Sure, on the surface it sounds great, but think about it. Because of China, did jobs in the US increase or decrease? They brought China into the WTO and outsourced manufacturing to them. So did American jobs go up or down? They declined. Clearly they declined. Because the Bush administration only lasted one term. Clinton took over and essentially resolved the issue as if Tiananmen had never happened. Surprisingly, George H.W. Bush was a pure realist in foreign policy. As we saw earlier, his letter didn't mention human rights at all. Yet by maintaining détente with China, America was free to conduct idealist diplomacy elsewhere. In The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, Professor John Mearsheimer argues that even after the Soviet collapse, the US maintained its alliance with China, which meant it had no major rival to restrain it. And so it intervened in Eurasian wars freely, for better or worse. The First Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya, America intervened in them all. They did so with no hesitation. For many of you, these wars are what dominate your memory of that era. One thing that surprised me while studying Bitcoin is this. The belief in American omnipotence is shockingly widespread. But when you study history and geopolitics, you realize that's just not true. Look how submissive the US was after Tiananmen. If any other country had done that, American idealists would never have let it slide. Sanctions would have hit hard, no joke. Just look at what they're doing to Russia now. Complete shutdown, corporations pulling out. And that was a war between states, not civilians being crushed. But in China, they ran over civilians with tanks. The US even counted bodies via satellite. They estimated 10,245 dead, then sealed it as a national secret. China claimed a few hundred and the world just moved on. So is America really omnipotent? What do you think? The America you've seen is the one that fought the Gulf War, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq again, and Libya. You think they're all powerful because of that, but in truth, it was America's allies who often held it back. France was the most outspoken. China, they said absolutely nothing. Take Afghanistan, it shares a border with China. That would normally be a sensitive issue for China because it meant US troops were stationed right next door. In the past, they'd have said, "You're surrounding us." But at the time, they said nothing, total silence. As Peter Zion put it, they'd been heavily bribed by the United States. Basically, the US gave China a massive bribe. Just stay quiet for us. And that's where the irony lies, right? If President George H.W. Bush had been an idealist, he never would have let Deng Xiaoping's regime off the hook after Tiananmen. But because he was a realist, he arranged a stage-managed solution. They coordinated the asylum of a Chinese lawyer, using it as a symbolic gesture, essentially saving China, though that may not be the right word. Through the efforts of realist presidents like him, America eventually became a playground for unrealistic idealists. They ruined it, the whole thing got distorted, and now Americans are exhausted. That fatigue has led to a growing desire for non-intervention. But because the US cut China so much slack, and as Koreans, while we talk geopolitics, we can't leave ourselves out of the story. We were the ones who hit the jackpot. Korea benefited the most. Look at this chart. Once China joined the WTO, China overtook the US as Korea's top trading partner. Exports and imports varied slightly, but overall, China dominated. Korean exports to China soared after its WTO accession. But if you look closely at the data, much of it was actually goods exported through China to the US. So in the end, the US was still Korea's true top export destination. This shift toward China is often overestimated because those goods weren't going into China's domestic market. They were simply passing through China, ending up in the hands of American consumers. If you do the math, even up until a few years ago, the US was still Korea's top trade partner. Either way, we hit the jackpot. We had a booming double-digit growth economy right next door for over a decade. From China's perspective, we're not a country they can afford to ignore. This is data from 2018. Very clear, right? It's a map based on how much money China earns from exports to each country. Let's exclude Hong Kong. It's technically part of China. After the US and Japan, the next largest isn't Germany, it's Korea. South Korea is huge, $110 billion in trade. Germany, only $78 billion, only Japan is larger. The UK and India are smaller. You didn't know that, did you? China depends on us too. South Korea is amazing. How did we even manage this? Now let's talk about THAAD and China's retaliatory sanctions. China tries to scare us, and honestly, we are afraid of China. We should be more wary of Japan, but Koreans aren't. That's just how we are. But China, we genuinely fear. In 2016, after the THAAD deployment, Lotte got wiped out, Hyundai and Kia sales plummeted. China's foreign direct investment in Korea dropped sharply in 2016. It looked like it might recover in 2017, but then COVID hit, and what followed was a real divorce between the US and China. Back during George H.W. Bush's time, marriage was underway, but Tiananmen interrupted it. It almost led to divorce, but it got patched up. This time, it's real. That's the arc of this lecture. A real divorce. In 2013, then Vice President Joe Biden met President Park Geun-hye and said this: "Betting against America is never a good bet." That's the literal phrasing. And that's exactly how it was interpreted. Then pro-China voices in Korea flipped out, saying it was a mistranslation. So both governments came out and claimed that wasn't the intent. So if you look at the broader context, it was clearly emphasizing President Obama's rebalancing Asia strategy. The intended meaning was more like, you think America can't follow through? That's a serious miscalculation. But it got translated as betting on China against the US is a bad bet, and people called it a mistranslation. That's the problem with some Korean intellectuals. It wasn't a mistranslation. It was actually a precise interpretation. You don't argue over semantics. You look at what happened afterward. Diplomats don't usually talk like that, ever. Biden only said it because President Park Geun-hye was leaning way too far toward China, and the US noticed. So what was rebalancing exactly? It was a foreign policy agenda introduced under President Obama to reduce US presence in Europe and the Middle East and shift America's strategic focus toward Asia to counterbalance China. Basically, I'm not leaving Asia from now on. You're going to see a bold, assertive US presence, not just China. Even with that interpretation, the message remains the same. It was still a direct message to the Park Geun-hye administration back in 2013. I don't usually follow the news closely, but when Biden said that, I had to look up the original quote. It was so direct, it gave me chills. Diplomats just don't talk like that. He must have been extremely alarmed to speak so bluntly in person. He said, "Betting against us is not a good idea." And he didn't say that in Japan. He said it in South Korea. That was a very clear warning. One issue with Koreans is that we're often geopolitically unaware. During the détente between the US and China, our pro-China stance didn't seem like a problem. But even then, we were quietly accumulating consequences. If you've ever been a boss, you'll understand this. You can overlook something when your counterpart makes a mistake. Even with a competitor, I might speak diplomatically. But what if my subordinate acts even more conciliatory than I do? I was planning to give them some slack, but now my subordinate's doing even more than me. Do I think, wow, what a loyal subordinate? Not likely. What I really think is, this guy's overstepping. Subordinates are supposed to play the bad cop. That's exactly the role Mao Zedong played. His underlings wreaked havoc. Millions were starved to death during the Cultural Revolution. Whether it was millions or tens of millions, between the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, it was catastrophic. And then he meets Nixon and casually says, Taiwan is a small matter, the world is the real issue. That works because the people below are shouting, down with American imperialism. So the guy at the top can then smile and say, sure, keep your troops here, stay 100 years if you like. Your subordinates going around cutting even more slack than you. You'd think, I was going to let it slide, but now I can't because of you. That line Biden gave, it wasn't diplomatic language, it was blunt, straight up. And yet the Park Geun-hye administration failed to pick up on that signal. So things escalated. She visited China in September 2015. Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, was also there. Among Western leaders, Park was the only one who stood on that stage. The rest, as they say, is history. You know how it ended for her? I'm not pushing a conspiracy here. I'm saying read the signals clearly. Just the other day, CNBC reported the US urging allies to join the Chip Alliance. Not potato chips, but semiconductors. They're putting serious pressure to join the Chip Alliance. And this time, the messaging is crystal clear, as if they're worried someone might still miss the point. After all, people missed the point when Biden said it as vice president. So now, as president, he spells it out even more clearly. It's against China. Don't transfer semiconductor tech to China. That's the purpose of the Chip 4 Alliance. The members, the US, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. There's no room for misunderstanding this time. It's not open to mistranslation. President Yoon was clapping along when they visited Samsung. Biden came to South Korea and visited Samsung, remember? Whether we like it or not, we are now living in a geopolitical era. Realist political theorists have a name for this era we're living through. The era when I was your age, my 20s and 30s, we call that a holiday in history. A brief period when it felt like geopolitics didn't matter, like it had disappeared. But that historical holiday is over. Now companies like Samsung have tough choices to make. If you want to keep doing business with the US, then stop doing business with China. But Korea seems to be the only one not getting the message. We're saying, can't you cut us some slack? We have a special relationship with China. Of the Chip 4 Alliance, South Korea is the only one hesitating. I'm not judging, I'm just saying it's up to you to evaluate. If China was forgiven even for Tiananmen, how did they get to this point? Honestly, most of you didn't know the US and China were once this close. That closeness didn't suddenly fall apart. It took years to unravel. The signs were already there in the early 2010s. But from the lens of realist international relations theory, even if China were a country made by angels, this trajectory was inevitable. That's geopolitics. Simply put, China is right next to us. Even if it were made up of nothing but angels, we must understand that China's rise is structurally at odds with our national interests. But whenever we talk about China these days, we keep slipping into moral discourse, ethical narratives. If China does something bad, then we dislike them. If they do something good, then we like them. But geopolitics doesn't work like that. It's not about feelings or morality. At the root of it all is this. China is simply getting too strong. Even if China hadn't triggered these specific events, we still would have ended up in the era we're seeing now. But China keeps giving us these additional provocations. Those are just extra reasons layered on top. The core reason is simple. China is getting too strong. That's it. Even if angels were rising to power, the US would still take the same strategic path. But China is not made of angels, far from it. Here's what happened. The Philippines asked the US to leave and the US left. As soon as they left, islands right off the coast of the Philippines were suddenly occupied by Chinese civilians. That's how China operates. They send civilians, not troops, to quietly take control. There had already been tension, but disputes over coral islands in the South China Sea kept escalating. There are constant clashes that don't make the news. Boats rammed, fishing vessels harassed. Eventually, the Philippines said they couldn't take it anymore. In 2016, under President Obama, a legal ruling came down. It stated that China's claims in the South China Sea had no legal basis. China immediately shifted into a combat-ready posture, and that's the issue. China is now powerful. That's why international relations scholars often compare China's rise to that of Imperial Germany before World War I. Germany became a problem because it grew too strong. Without that, World War I wouldn't have happened. Germany's rise in Central Europe changed the balance entirely. That's why Britain, France, and Russia had no choice but to join forces. This is how it escalated, eventually leading to World War I. But China isn't even being cautious. China is effectively saying, international law, throw it to the dogs, who cares? Even Western pro-China voices are starting to fall silent. The old belief was, help China grow and they'll democratize, open up, and follow international norms. Advocates like George H.W. Bush made the case for engagement. They have long fought against realist voices calling for the containment of China. But now China is embarrassing the very people who once defended them. They're saying, international law, we're not interested, doesn't apply to us. The most pivotal incident, let me ask you, why are you wearing masks right now? Because of COVID-19, but doesn't that name strike you as strange? Normally, pandemics are named after places of origin. Think of African swine fever. Geographic names are standard. Now, imagine a disease that locked down the planet and caused millions of deaths. If that disease had started in Fukuoka, Japan, don't you think we'd call it Fukuoka fever? So why don't we call it Wuhan pneumonia? We act like geopolitics doesn't exist. But when China is involved, suddenly geopolitics does exist and everyone tiptoes. We're afraid of China, and we're not the only ones. Even Nature has finally published what used to be dismissed as conspiracy theory. Each of these, every detail, carries meaning. I used to think this was just conspiracy talk from third-rate YouTubers, but now Nature has brought it up. They said, let's re-examine the hypothesis that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan lab during a military bioweapons project. Mainstream scientists don't really believe it. It sounds too far-fetched. Remember, the key phrase is, mainstream scientists don't believe it yet. Why did this resurface? Because President Biden tasked the CIA and intelligence agencies to investigate. He said, investigate Wuhan, even if the fish market theory is mainstream. There's a growing belief it came from the lab. Look into it and give me a report. The report came out. What I'm telling you now is a summary of Nature's coverage. The Wuhan Institute had in fact been studying coronaviruses. There are published papers. Despite widespread speculation that it jumped naturally from animals to humans, the lab leak theory hasn't gone away, especially since the Wuhan lab has military ties. Since this became a global issue, you'd think they'd at least stage a diplomatic gesture, like Bush and Deng Xiaoping once did. But Xi Jinping isn't that kind of leader. His response is basically, don't come, stay out. And there's precedent for this. In 2004, 2 researchers at a Beijing virology lab infected 7 others. It was contained quickly. But during SARS, China also heavily covered up outbreaks. Nature's position is nuanced. Did it really come from the Wuhan lab? Scientists may not buy the lab theory, but China blocking investigations is a serious problem. That's the takeaway. The US intelligence report didn't rule out the lab leak origin. There are 2 competing theories. One, it jumped from nature, like via bats in a market. The other, it accidentally leaked while developing bioweapons in a research lab. Both theories are considered plausible. China's cooperation is needed to reach a definitive conclusion. That's how diplomats talk, would be needed. That's the diplomatic register. But in plain everyday terms, it would sound more like, hey, investigate this. Yeah. And China keeps making these blunders, right? In short, China has simply grown too powerful. Just like Imperial Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm before World War I, it grew too strong. Even if angels had built, Germany, Britain, France, and Russia would still have felt threatened. And China isn't just strong, it keeps racking up major blunders one after another. COVID was a massive one. We've been wearing masks for years now, plastic dividers everywhere. We know how to coexist with China. We understand what it wants. Let's be honest, Korea and China aren't equals. There's a hierarchy, as Confucius would say. Small states serve big states. Subjects serve their kings. We're used to that framework. So under President Lee Myung-bok, if I recall, a Korean diplomat in China died after a hospital gave him the wrong IV treatment. And what did China do? They cremated the body so it couldn't be autopsied. And we just let it go because we've lived with China for centuries. We say, those bastards, but they're a major power, and move on. But you must not be mistaken. Even if Europe seems weak or sick, it's still the West, especially Europe and the US, that shapes the global narrative. We view the world through their lens. For example, in the case of Russia and Ukraine. How would we really know who the good guys are? But we see things through the Western narrative because that's how the media presents it, consciously or not. Western countries don't let things slide. These diplomatic protocols were earned through history. These norms respecting embassies' sovereignty were paid for in blood. You can't just walk into an embassy and start beating people with sticks. But Chinese police have crossed into the South Korean embassy and beaten people, our embassy, and yet we don't report it in the media because we know how to survive next to China. Let's now examine Xi Jinping, the figure at the center of all this. Who is Xi Jinping? He's far too important not to study. He's a princeling, a child of the revolutionary elite, the son of Xi Zhongxun. His father was rehabilitated under Deng Xiaoping. But during the Cultural Revolution, even the revolutionary generation suffered. Xi himself suffered greatly, persecuted because of Mao's political campaigns. He later recalled the experience as deeply dystopian. His classmates would constantly force him to self-criticize because his father was a party elder. The Cultural Revolution was chaos. You can think of it like this. In the countryside, kids from poor backgrounds bullied urban kids. In the cities, the poor targeted the better off openly and aggressively. And they did it gleefully, calling it eliminating capitalist sympathizers. It was a chance for the underprivileged and uneducated to finally dominate. For once, they had the upper hand. So they relentlessly bullied the kids who were smart, well-off, or from good families, openly, systemically. Criticize, self-criticize. And if you didn't comply, you were heavily bullied. Deng Xiaoping's son, who was studying at Peking University, a prestigious school in China, was bullied and tortured by rural youths, then thrown off a rooftop, leaving him paralyzed. Xi Jinping also suffered. He was sent down to the countryside, where he literally shoveled human waste. Chinese toilets weren't like Korean ones. Back then, both countries were poor, but Koreans were relatively clean. Even today, despite their prosperity, China still struggles with hygiene, and Xi cleaned those kinds of latrines. He had a half-sister in the end. She couldn't take it anymore and hanged herself in the village she'd been exiled to. That's when Xi Jinping made a resolution. I will survive no matter what. He too went through the furnace and came out hardened, unshakable. He applied to join the Communist Party, was rejected 9 times. Things didn't seem to click for him. Maybe he failed exams or lacked appeal. In 1997, he placed 151st for a Central Committee seat. Only 150 spots were open. But Jiang Zemin said he's Xi Zhongxun's son, changed the rule and made 151 an exception. He got in by special favor. By 2005, it was time to name Hu Jintao's successor to the Politburo Standing Committee. That's how China works. There's always a preparatory phase before someone becomes president. And there were 2 contenders. Xi Jinping wasn't even on the short list. But suddenly he rose to the top. Not just as president, but now he's in for a 3rd term, possibly even president for life. This is exactly what Deng Xiaoping tried so hard to abolish, even writing it into the system as he retired. Deng declared, China will no longer be ruled by one man. We will limit terms to 10 years. That's why I can understand George H.W. Bush. He really admired Deng. Deng was huge, a genuine reformist. But when Deng was cornered, Bush wanted desperately to help pull him out. I'm not saying it was the right call. I honestly don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I just don't know enough. My knowledge and information are limited. Anyway, Deng worked so hard to abolish personalist authoritarian rule, and Chinese history is soaked in authoritarianism. So who is Xi Jinping, bringing back the very system Deng tried to dismantle? His father, Xi Zhongxun, served as party secretary in Shenzhen, I believe. At China's 40th anniversary of reform and opening up, they unveiled a symbolic image. Deng Xiaoping seated, admiring, and Xi's father is shown briefing him on Shenzhen's development. They even altered the painting to make Xi Jinping resemble his father, even though in real photos they don't really look alike. The message was, my father was the true pioneer of reform and opening. Deng Xiaoping just followed in his footsteps. That was the implication. But public reaction, even within China, was negative. The piece was quietly taken down. Xi Jinping has been systematically erasing Deng Xiaoping. Why? Because Deng had already handpicked Jiang Zemin, then Hu Jintao. And said, 10 years for Jiang, 10 for Hu, then it's up to the future. The assumption was that with political stability and development, China would eventually liberalize, though it's unclear whether Deng envisioned full democratization. But Xi wasn't Deng's pick. And now he's breaking Deng's 10-year term limit, trying to become president for life. So he's on a mission to erase Deng Xiaoping from history. Even though Deng was the true architect of China's 40 years of reform and opening, going on the southern tour, mentoring his successors. He was a selfless reformer, deeply committed to modernizing China. And now Deng's books vanished from bookstores, erased. Xi is turning back toward Mao, even though Mao was the one who caused him great suffering. He sent Xi down to the countryside, made him shovel excrement. It's deeply ironic. President George H.W. Bush was a realist and in saving China. He inadvertently enabled his successors to spend the next decade recklessly pushing idealistic propaganda. Xi suffered under Mao and saw his father restored to power by Deng Xiaoping. And yet here is Xi, erasing Deng and embracing Mao. The irony couldn't be greater. We can't talk about this without mentioning Gorbachev. For Chinese leaders, especially Xi Jinping, Gorbachev is a constant reference point. Xi has referenced him many times, and Gorbachev passed away just recently. He tried to implement economic and political reform simultaneously, only to face a coup and be ousted. It was unprecedented, a Soviet leader holding open discussions with Moscow citizens. To see the once feared Soviet General Secretary debating live on TV, it was admirable in many ways. He was treated as a respected global figure after the collapse. But the Soviet Union itself had failed. This giant Soviet Russia couldn't transition smoothly through reform and opening. It lost control, spiraled, and eventually disintegrated. Eventually, Putin stepped in to pick up the pieces, and now we see the results of that. Xi and China's leadership are determined. We must never become like Russia. Xi keeps repeating one core message. The Communist Party must earn the people's trust, and it must stay in power. In short, political reform is out of the question. That's why China is upfront about systems like this. Social credit scoring. They look at income, credit card payments, all the usual things. They also review criminal records and even school grades. All of this data goes directly to the central government. Even your online activity, your comments are monitored. What's more important, China has the world's largest number of undocumented residents. And in China, undocumented doesn't mean foreigners, it means their own people. Many Chinese citizens can't obtain urban hukou, the official household registration. So their kids can't attend public schools, they have to send them to low-tier private ones. These people are called Nongmin-gong, migrant workers who sustain China's low-cost economy. If they protest or unionize, the government says, back to the countryside, and sends them away. So they created a scoring system to grant hukou based on behavior, like you've earned it, you're now a Beijinger, a Shanghainese, a citizen of Guangdong. China's AI technology is advancing rapidly. Facial recognition and CCTV are everywhere. We often think IT and data will bring us things like the metaverse, limitless human potential, the pinnacle of human progress maybe. But China looks more like an Orwellian society. Like in George Orwell's 1984, a big brother surveillance state, COVID was a perfect excuse. But leaders like Xi Jinping, strong in politics, often fall short in economics. Because economics behaves like natural law, it doesn't respond well to political control. This might be the first time since the 1990s reform era that China's growth rate is projected to fall behind other East Asian nations, according to today's Financial Times. Why? Because China is still in full lockdown mode. Back in 2020 and 2021, books were coming out saying, the Western model is over. It's time for the East Asian model. Korea handled COVID superbly. And look at China. Wow. In times like this, you need the state to act swiftly and firmly. But now no one says that anymore because China is still locked down. The idea that China's growth rate might be lower than ours, that's astounding. It's not just Korea, Japan and probably Taiwan are included too. In the graph, the blue line is East Asia without China, and the red line is China, and they're about to cross. If China keeps its lockdown policy, the roles might reverse. Zero COVID. According to today's paper, 97% of Koreans have developed antibodies. Wearing masks doesn't make much sense anymore. If 97% have antibodies, we're all covered. How can society function under a zero COVID policy? So how does Xi Jinping stay in power so long, and why is he still popular? He's actually very popular, but don't view this through our lens. The Chinese people don't seem interested in replacing him. They like him because Xi launched a major anti-corruption campaign. This graph shows the number of senior officials Xi has brought down each year. Anywhere in the world, when you take down elites, the public cheers. What Deng Xiaoping tried to do was build up technocrats to check the party's overreach. That's why Deng appointed people who were technocrats, not just political loyalists, so that experts could have enough influence to balance party politicians. He tried to empower experts alongside politicians. His goal was to modernize China through this division of influence. Xi has reversed that, returning full control to the Communist Party, and for the party to maintain public respect, it must appear clean. That's why he continues the anti-corruption campaign. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Professor Wang Yuhua, a Chinese scholar at Harvard, interprets it this way. After analyzing 49 dynasties over 2,000 years, she found that the greatest threat to emperors wasn't rebellion or foreign invasion. The real threat came from the aristocratic clans that supported them. Her study dates back to 211 BC. Out of 282 emperors, 76 were forced to step down and ultimately killed by their own elite allies. So emperors had to crush the bonds between noble families. In Xi Jinping's case, those nobles are the Communist Party elites. They are the ones who sustain his power. No matter how powerful I am, if no one below me executes my will, it means nothing. Remember when those US lawmakers came and unfurled a banner in Tiananmen? That young officer, his eyes fierce, immediately shut it down, pushed out the press. You need people like that, zealots who truly believe in what they're enforcing. Power only works when that chain of conviction runs from top to bottom. No single ruler can accomplish anything alone. But the paradox is, if you want to rule long, you must weaken the very people you depend on. Xi needs the party elites to be strong enough to defend him, but not so strong that they can challenge his authority. That's the delicate balance. Seen from that angle, Xi Jinping's actions start to make a lot more sense. The party has also extended its control over the private sector, and this isn't new. It seems to have started right after Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. According to today's Financial Times, even university research institutes are affected now. They're being told not to co-author papers or collaborate with scholars from the US or the West. That's academic regression. Some research centers are even being shut down, especially economic think tanks that have been critical of Xi's economic policies. One reason China is far from being an advanced nation: you can't trust the data. In this kind of political climate, how can accurate statistics even exist? Well, 90% of Chinese PhDs educated in the US choose to stay in the US. They study and conduct research in the US. And yes, China has a huge talent pool. And let's be honest, many of them are exceptionally gifted. They become part of America's human capital. So as China grows stronger, the US cancels their visas. Now it's common to see them sent back after graduation or even barred from entering doctoral programs. That's why I say this time it's a real divorce. Unlike after Tiananmen in 1989, back then it looked like the top level was divorcing. But on the ground, everyone was scrambling to preserve the relationship. Now, when you look at the data, the ties are being cut from the bottom up by both the US and China. In the US, there's barely any difference between Republicans and Democrats on China policy. The US is denying visas to Chinese researchers from the bottom up. Meanwhile, China is blocking joint research with American academics. But China isn't just another country, it's the world's second largest economy. If we want to forecast global economics accurately, we have to work with people inside China. If China were more like North Korea or Laos, you could exclude them from global datasets. But how do you exclude the world's #2 economy from your statistics? So cooperation is essential, but China is cutting that off. There are counter-arguments as well. Most large Chinese companies aren't private, they're state-owned enterprises. Yet under Xi Jinping, the share of the private sector has continued to grow. I'm showing you this chart not just because of that, but because the sheer scale of state ownership in China is enormous. If you rank companies by revenue on the Fortune Global 500 list, until 2006, every Chinese company listed was a state-owned enterprise. Even now, though not overtly, China is quietly cracking down on private firms. Many high-profile entrepreneurs, especially in tech, are suddenly stepping down. So what's Xi Jinping's agenda? China may not hold elections. But as a politician, he still has to be aware of public sentiment. They're invisible voters. They don't vote, but we still refer to them that way. He's pledged to tackle inequality through a policy of common prosperity. China is an extremely unequal society. The top 1% holds 30% of all wealth. The bottom 25% holds just 1% of the wealth. Its Gini coefficient is among the worst in the world. So in a country like this, pursuing common prosperity, a policy of redistributing wealth, is totally reasonable. It makes perfect sense. This part isn't the issue. It's something that should happen. The problem is they're relying on heavy-handed, predictable methods to do it. So what's the obvious method? They're going after the rich, cracking down on wealth. 200 million migrant workers can't access public welfare. As I said earlier, they're undocumented within their own country. They're Chinese citizens living in cities without city hukou, so they're barred from public services. They've changed the rules. Cities with fewer than 300,000 people can now grant hukou. In larger cities, they're trying to base hukou on the social credit scoring system I mentioned earlier. This color-coded map shows income inequality across Chinese regions at a glance. Coastal regions are clearly more prosperous. Central regions are mixed. And then there are even more remote, underdeveloped areas, like Heilongjiang in the north, historically linked to Korea, what we once called Gando, Jilin Liaoning. Those areas have very low incomes. Then you have Xinjiang and Tibet, not just poor, but treated as second-class citizens. From China's perspective, which we often ignore, this is a conqueror-conquered dynamic, plain and simple. This is the backdrop in which Xi Jinping is pushing toward a third term, possibly for life. And like Putin, stepping down mid-game is no longer an option. Hu Jintao, for instance, is still alive, though he's no longer active publicly. But Xi has jailed and purged so many elites. Letting go of power wouldn't make him safe anymore. Same with Putin. Once you start this game, you have to play it to the end. And these are the agendas he has to navigate in order to stay the course. China has already grown so large that it exerts massive pressure on the entire world. Even if China were run by angels, it would still reshape the geopolitical order, which means the Western world has to band together and respond. But of course, China isn't run by angels. It's not, in fact, it's riddled with human rights abuses, inequality, and pollution. I didn't even touch on pollution today, but it's a huge problem. And China continues to generate global disruptions. So the current conflict structure between China and the West is likely very real. The reconciliation between the US and China that began in 1972 lasted 50 years. And those who bet against it were all punished or sidelined. People said, this US-China thing is temporary, China won't go any further. Those pessimists were all left behind when China's power exploded. So what's the point? If the US-China relationship is now being reset like this, we're looking at another 20 to 30 years. This isn't something that ends in a year or two. Taming a giant like China isn't a one-year project. You have to plan over 10, 20 years. If you still bet on China with the same old China dream mindset, it'll all blow up again. Even when you just read the news, you'll notice that Korean companies act on privileged information. It's all there, plain to see. So when you read the news, read it with this framework in mind, especially as we talk about monetary systems. Next time, we'll have to talk about Europe. We'll revisit what we've studied so far with a fresh perspective. The takeaway is Bitcoin matters. This course has 15 lectures, but we've only covered 5. By the end of all 15 lectures, you'll probably conclude, I should buy Bitcoin. Great work today, everyone. See you next week. Thank you.